Good morning, friends. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome if it's your first time here. Today we are going to be transforming some cotton fabric into a custom gathered lampshade that I am so excited about. This is my first time trying to do this, and I'm going to bring you along for the ride. So this fabric has been sitting in my fabric bin for years, since I stopped working at Joann Fabrics, which I think was maybe back in 2008. I love it so much, and I've been hanging on to it for just the right project, and I decided that the time is now. I decided to try it with this fabric because it's fairly light. It's just a cotton, and I feel like the light will pass through it effectively while still giving me that beautiful pattern. So the first thing I did was to iron it out, check it over for any defects. Like I said, it had been in a bin for a very long time, so it really needed to be pressed and steamed. As I've mentioned before, I just love ironing. It's so soothing to me. It's such a calming, meditative kind of thing to do. Once I determined that I needed about 12 inches of fabric to comfortably encircle the shade with a little bit of overlap on each side, I used my rotary cutter and mat to cut nice, precise pieces of 12-inch wide fabric. The pieces that I trimmed off on the edges I used to make bias tape. Since it was not one continuous piece of fabric, I chose to join them together to make one long piece. If I had been pleating this shade, I think I could have gotten away with just adding this on when it was time, but since it was my first time doing this and I knew that I'd be gathering it all up to fit the shade, I felt it was worth putting a French seam in quickly to, again, make it one long continuous piece of fabric. If this is not a step that you need to take for your piece, feel free to skip to the next section. For this project, if you choose to go the no-sew route, you absolutely could just glue these pieces together. But since I have the machine and I could quickly run the seam up, I chose to do it that way. To make my French seam, I laid the two pieces of fabric wrong sides together, trimmed the edge off to make it nice and straight, and then took this section over to the machine to just run a straight 1/4 inch seam. After stitching the two right sides together, I went over to my ironing board, pressed the seam flat, and then inverted the pieces so that the right sides are together, as you would do with a traditional seam. Once that was pressed flat with one section to one side, this section is then sewn together so that you have a nice, neat, enclosed seam with no fraying edges. This is a nice, simple technique for garment construction, especially with pieces you're going to wash. Next, I made the bias tape, and I did this by taking the pieces I had trimmed off, the 2-inch pieces, and folding them first in half, pressing them in half, then folding them into quarters, meeting at the center seam, and folding that whole piece in half. So we then have the raw edges joined at the center and the finished edges folded to meet at one edge. I then take my hot glue gun and run a bead of glue along the inner fold and press it closed. Quick and easy. Again, you could just use traditional fabric glue if you wanted to here, or you could even use the no-sew hem tape if you chose. Okay, now that that's complete, we are ready to fit the fabric to the shade. Starting at the seam, I took the fabric and laid it onto the shade and used these handy dandy binder clips to attach it temporarily to the rim of the shade. Once I got back to the seam, I folded that piece under and clipped it into place. Now I have this big extra piece of fabric, and I decided to section it off into quarters using these binder clips again. So by eye, I just determined approximately half the piece, clipped it into place, and then half of each of those sections and clipped those into place. Now, in theory, I could have gathered the whole piece onto one long piece of thread, but that is a long piece of thread, and that's asking for trouble in my opinion, with snarling and with trying to manage that long piece of fabric. So I gathered each section by hand with the needle. Gathering it in sections let me control what I was doing and give me an idea of how tightly I needed to gather things as I was going along. Hopefully you can see that in the video. I used a thread that was slightly contrasting but would not be overly obvious. So you can see here that I gathered the one section and then gently tightened the piece of thread to pull the gathers together and fit them along the bottom edge. I continued this for each section until I had the fabric gently fitted to the bottom rim. I then turned the shade over and repeated this along the top, hand gathering each section again in quarters. Here you may be able to see my hand gathering technique a little bit better. I kept the seam in the same place as the original seam, and here you can see I'm affixing the fabric with some hot glue and overlapping it at the fold, again securing with some glue. Now the top and the bottom are both gathered and fitted to each ring of the lampshade, and they are clipped in place still at this point. So I took a minute to just sort of shuffle the fabric back and forth a little and get an idea of how it was going to lay on the surface of this shade. And when I was happy with the placement, I took the hot glue gun and secured the fabric along the bottom edge of the shade. Okay, so once that was complete, I turned to the top edge and, starting at the seam, put a bead of glue at the top, pulled the seam nice and tight, and firmly attached it to the top rim of the shade. From there, I worked my way around the shade. I did want it to have a naturally gathered look, but I also was finding that aesthetically it looked nice to have the folds all leaning in one direction. So I just teased them that way. And as I went along, I started tacking it down with the glue gun. Pulling it nice and taut and firm really seemed to improve the look of the gathers. Once the top rim was completely glued in place, I trimmed off the excess fabric, folded it over, and glued it on the inlet rim. Now it was time to attach the bias tape. So I laid the shade on its side and, again, determined where the seam was so that my overlap would be at the original seam. Using my hot glue gun, I laid down a nice bead of hot glue. And you can see I pulled a little bit on the tape to keep it nice and taut and straight. I continued this all along the edge until I got to the seam, where I just folded the end under, cut it to the appropriate length, and secured it with glue. On the bottom edge, I gave this very slightest overlap of the bias tape so that the original edge of the shade was concealed. But on the top, I chose to line it right up with the top edge. I'm so sorry, my birds are being so loud today, and I don't know why, but they are really just living their best life today. I would caution you to be attentive to how much glue you're using, as you do want enough, of course, to secure it, but it could be easy to have glue squishing out on the sides of the fabric, and I personally would find that to be a sloppy look, so I was careful of that as I went along. And there we have it, a custom gathered lampshade that I think just totally levels up this beautiful torchère lamp. I hope you give this project a try. If you do, let me know how it goes. And thank you for watching today. I appreciate every one of you, and I appreciate all your likes and subscribes, and I will see you all again soon.